The following story contains descriptions of paranormal phenomena, psychological tension, and supernatural occurrences. It is intended for entertainment purposes and viewers who enjoy the chilling lore of American folklore. Listener discretion is advised. The sun was dipping low behind the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rolling hills of Maryland. It was that peculiar hour of the evening when the sky turns the color of a fresh bruise, deep purples and angry oranges clashing against the encroaching black. For the Miller family, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one they hoped would be filled with the peace of the countryside and the simplicity of rural life. Elias Miller gripped the steering wheel of the family's dusty SUV, his eyes tired but hopeful. Beside him, Sarah was humming a soft hymn, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the worn leather of her Bible. In the back seat, 10-year-old Lily was pressed against the window, watching the ancient oaks and maples blur past like silent sentinels. They were heading toward Blackwood Manor, a sprawling, centuries-old farmhouse that had been left to Elias by a distant uncle he had never met. As the car turned onto a gravel path overgrown with weeds and Queen Anne's lace, the atmosphere changed. The cheerful chirping of the Maryland cicadas suddenly fell silent, replaced by an unnerving stillness that seemed to press against the windows. The house loomed ahead, a grand, white-clapboard structure that might have been beautiful 50 years ago, but now looked like a bleached skull staring out from the darkness of the woods. Elias killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. "It's bigger than the pictures," he whispered, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. Sarah stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the dry earth. She looked up at the darkened windows of the second floor and felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl down her spine, despite the humid Maryland summer air. It felt as though the house wasn't just standing there. It felt as though it was waiting. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar, dust, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like old coins or dried blood. They spent the first few hours moving boxes by the light of flickering lanterns, as the electricity hadn't been fully restored. Every floorboard groaned under their weight, echoing through the empty halls like a complaint. Lily, usually a vibrant and talkative child, remained unusually quiet, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest. "Daddy!" Lily's voice was small, cutting through the gloom of the kitchen. Elias looked up from a stack of crates. "Why does the house smell like it's crying?" Elias laughed softly, ruffling her hair. "Houses don't cry, Lil Bug. It's just old wood and damp air. We'll have the fireplace going tomorrow, and it'll smell like pine and toasted marshmallows." But even as he spoke, he noticed a patch of frost forming on the inside of the window pane, despite the thermometer outside reading 80 degrees. That night, as the family huddled together in the master bedroom on makeshift pallets, the house began to speak. It wasn't the wind or the settling of timber. It was a rhythmic, slow thudding coming from beneath the floorboards, a sound like a heavy heart beating in the very earth itself. Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the stories he'd heard in town about the hollowed ground were more than just local superstition. In the corner of the room, Sarah's Bible sat on a nightstand. As the clock struck midnight, the pages began to flutter rapidly, as if caught in a localized gale, eventually stopping at a verse in the book of Psalms. "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." Outside, a single, high-pitched owl shrieked, and then total silence returned. The inheritance was theirs, but the Millers were beginning to realize that some gifts come with a price that cannot be measured in gold. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else, like family and faith, is more important than that fear. Just as Elias began to drift into a fitful sleep, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinct, clear sound of a child's laughter coming from the sealed cellar door downstairs. But Lily was fast asleep right beside him. The Maryland morning arrived with a deceptive brilliance. Gold-spun sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of ancient oaks, and the dew on the meadows sparkled like scattered diamonds. To any outsider driving down the rural county road, Blackwood Manor looked like a dream of American pastoral life. But inside the house, the warmth of the sun felt thin and fragile, unable to penetrate the deep, stubborn chill that had settled in the corners of the rooms overnight. Elias woke with the heavy rhythm of that phantom heartbeat still drumming in his mind. He looked at Sarah and Lily, both still asleep, their faces pale in the gray morning light. He tried to convince himself that the laughter he'd heard was merely the house settling, the groan of copper pipes or the wind whistling through the chimney. Yet, as he pulled on his boots, he felt a magnetic pull toward the kitchen, toward the narrow, heavy door that led down into the belly of the house. The cellar door was made of solid, unpainted oak, reinforced with iron straps that looked as though they belonged in a colonial fortress rather than a farmhouse. As Elias gripped the handle, he noticed something he hadn't seen the previous evening. A series of small, faint scratches near the floor, as if something or someone had been trying to claw their way out. He took a deep breath, whispered a short prayer for strength, and pulled. The door creaked open with a low, mournful groan that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Descending the stairs was like stepping into another season. The humid Maryland summer vanished, replaced by a tomb-like cold that turned Elias's breath into white plumes of mist. The cellar was a labyrinth of stone foundations and dirt floors, stacked high with the forgotten relics of the previous owners. Rusty farm tools, broken spinning wheels, and crates of moth-eaten linens lay shrouded in thick cobwebs. But it was the far wall that drew his attention, a wall that shouldn't have been there according to the house's exterior dimensions. In the center of the stone wall was a second door, much smaller and older, framed by heavy timber beams. It was sealed shut not with a lock, but with a thick, blackened wax poured over the seams, and a rusted iron bolt that had been hammered into place. As Elias stepped closer, the silence of the cellar was broken. It wasn't the laughter this time. It was a whisper, a dry, papery sound like dead leaves skittering across a grave. It wasn't one voice, but a frantic, overlapping chorus of hushed tones, all speaking a language that sounded like a distortion of English, twisted and backward. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice trembling. The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a weight pressing against his eardrums. He reached out a hand, his fingers inches away from the blackened wax seal, when a sudden, violent thud shook the door from the other side. It was a strike so powerful that dust rained down from the ceiling, and the iron bolt rattled in its housing. Elias stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Upstairs, he heard Sarah scream. Elias scrambled up the cellar stairs, bursting into the kitchen to find Sarah standing in the center of the room, her face ashen. She was pointing at the heavy oak dining table they had moved in the day before. Every single chair had been neatly inverted and stacked on top of the table in a perfect, impossible pyramid. Lily stood by the window, her eyes wide and vacant, staring out at the woods. "The man in the basement says he's hungry, Daddy," she said, her voice devoid of its usual childhood warmth. "He says the wax is getting thin." Sarah grabbed Elias's arm, her grip bruisingly tight. "Elias, something is wrong here. This isn't just an old house. This is a place where the light doesn't reach." Elias looked from his terrified wife to his distant daughter, then back at the cellar door. He realized then that the inheritance wasn't the land or the house. It was whatever was trapped behind that sealed door. The hollowed ground wasn't a legend. It was a warning they had ignored. Curiosity must be tempered with caution. Some doors are closed for a reason, and not every secret is meant to be uncovered without the proper preparation and respect for the unknown. That evening, as Elias tried to nail a heavy board across the cellar door to keep it shut, he found a small, silver locket snagged in a floorboard crack. When he snapped it open, he didn't find a photo, but a single, dried human tooth and a scrap of parchment that read, "The dead is blood, and the blood is home." The third day at Blackwood Manor began not with the song of birds, but with a heavy, suffocating fog that rolled off the Maryland marshes, swallowing the trees and pressing against the house like a damp shroud. Inside, the air felt stagnant, as if the oxygen was being slowly replaced by the scent of wet earth and ancient rot. Sarah Miller, a woman whose life was built on the bedrock of her convictions, felt a tremor in her spirit that she couldn't shake. She had always believed that light could dispel any darkness, but this darkness felt different. It felt hungry. While Elias was outside in the shed, obsessively sharpening an old axe he'd found, Sarah decided to take a stand. She didn't believe in running. She believed in reclaiming. She took her grandmother's silver rosary, a heavy, ornate piece blessed by a bishop decades ago, and began to walk the perimeter of the ground floor. Her voice, steady but quiet, rose in a soft cadence of prayer, her thumb moving rhythmically over the smooth beads. She moved from the kitchen to the parlor, her heart set on sealing the house against the malice she felt radiating from the cellar. As she reached the hallway leading to the basement door, the temperature plummeted. Her breath hitched, coming out in a sharp, crystalline puff. The shadows in the hallway seemed to detach themselves from the walls, stretching toward her like reaching fingers. Sarah closed her eyes, clutching the rosary tighter, her prayers growing more fervent. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," she whispered. But the house responded with a sound that made her blood turn to ice. A low, mocking hiss that seemed to come from the very wallpaper. Suddenly, the rosary in her hand grew searingly hot. Sarah gasped, nearly dropping it, as the silver beads began to vibrate with a violent intensity. A sharp crack echoed through the hallway, then another and another. To her horror, the heavy silver wire connecting the beads began to snap as if cut by invisible shears. One by one, the beads fell to the hardwood floor, bouncing and rolling into the shadows. The central crucifix, the heart of her protection, didn't just fall. It shattered into fine, gray dust before it even hit the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood frozen, staring at her empty, scorched palm. For the first time in her life, she felt truly vulnerable. The spiritual armor she had worn since childhood had been stripped away in an instant. From the top of the stairs, Lily watched her mother, her expression unervingly blank. The young girl was holding a crayon, drawing jagged, circular symbols on the wallpaper that Sarah didn't recognize. Symbols that looked like eyes weeping black tears. "Mommy?" Lily whispered, her voice sounding oddly resonant, like two people speaking in unison. "He says your words are just noise. He says the house remembers the old ways, before the books and the bells." Sarah rushed to her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace, but Lily remained stiff, her gaze fixed on the cellar door. The door, which Elias had boarded up just hours before, was now covered in a thin, glistening layer of what looked like black bile, slowly seeping through the cracks in the wood. Elias burst through the front door, sensing the shift in the house's energy. He saw Sarah trembling on the floor, the remnants of her faith scattered like birdseed. He saw the black fluid on the cellar door and the strange markings Lily had drawn. The pure evil they were facing wasn't just a haunting. It was an invasion of their very souls. The entity wasn't just trying to scare them. It was systematically breaking down the foundations of their peace, starting with the one thing Sarah held most dear. They spent the rest of the afternoon huddled in the kitchen, the only room that still felt somewhat theirs, though the corners remained stubbornly dark. Elias held the silver locket he'd found, the human tooth inside feeling heavy and cold against his chest. He realized that their prayers were being drowned out by a much older, darker power that had been rooted in this Maryland soil long before their ancestors had ever set foot on the continent. Faith is a powerful shield, but it must be matched with understanding and action. When facing a deep-rooted evil, one must look into the past to find the tools for the future. As the sun began to set, turning the fog into a ghostly orange haze, a heavy knock sounded at the front door. When Elias opened it, no one was there. Only a small, leather-bound book sitting on the porch, its cover stained with salt and tears, titled, The Ledger of the Blackwood Debt. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming on the tin roof of the porch, but by mid-morning, it had escalated into a violent Maryland deluge. Thunder rolled across the valley like the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the heavens. Inside the dimly lit kitchen, Elias sat with the mysterious ledger open before him. The parchment was brittle, smelling of salt and something metallic, the same scent that permeated the cellar. As he turned the pages, he realized this wasn't just a record of farming yields or weather patterns. It was a chronicle of tragedy. The ledger spoke of a man named Silas Blackwood, Elias's direct ancestor, who had settled this land in the late 1700s. Silas had been a man of immense greed and dwindling luck. According to the fading ink, a great sickness had taken his crops and his livestock, leaving him desperate. He had sought the help of a local man known only as the Healer of the Hollows, a man who lived in the deep woods and was rumored to hold secrets older than the colony itself. But Silas hadn't wanted healing. He had wanted prosperity at any cost. Elias's eyes widened as he read the entry dated October 14, 1792. Silas had betrayed the healer, accusing him of witchcraft to the local authorities to seize the healer's fertile valley. Before the man was driven into the wilderness to perish, he had supposedly knelt on the very spot where the cellar now stood and cast a hollowed curse. He didn't wish for Silas to die. He wished for Silas and all his kin to never truly be full again, emptying their spirits so that something else, something ancient and hungry, could crawl inside. The conflict of the morning intensified when the house itself seemed to react to the reading of its secret. In the parlor, the heavy velvet curtains began to sway violently, though the windows were locked tight. The air grew so thick with the scent of ozone and wet earth that Sarah had to cover her mouth with a cloth to breathe. "Elias, stop reading it," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "The more you know, the more it feels like it's looking at us. It's like the house is listening." But the pull of the truth was too strong. Elias found a loose photograph tucked between the pages, a tintype from the late 1800s. It showed a group of men standing in front of the manor, their faces blurred by time, except for one figure in the back. A tall, impossibly thin man with no eyes, just two dark, hollow pits where a gaze should be. As Elias stared at the photo, the figure's head seemed to tilt slightly toward him. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through Elias's chest, causing him to drop the book. At that moment, the power flickered and died, plunging the house into a suffocating gray twilight. From the hallway, they heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps, not from the cellar, but from the second floor. It was the sound of someone walking with a limp, dragging something heavy behind them. Lily, who had been sitting quietly by the hearth, suddenly pointed toward the darkened stairs. "The hollowed man is coming down, Daddy," she whispered with a terrifying calm. "He says he's finished with the ancestors. He wants the new blood now." Elias grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. It landed on the staircase, where a thick, black mist was rolling down the steps like a waterfall. Within the mist, they could see the faint outline of a figure, tall, skeletal, and draped in tatters of colonial-era clothing. The entity didn't speak, but the air around it vibrated with a low-frequency hum that made the kitchen glassware shatter. The resolution of the moment was a desperate retreat. Elias grabbed Sarah and Lily, backing into the kitchen's pantry and slamming the door, bolting it from the inside. For a long hour, they huddled together in the dark, listening to the entity pace outside the pantry door. It didn't try to break in. It simply waited, its heavy, uneven footsteps a constant reminder of the debt that remained unpaid. The terror was no longer a shadow in the corner. It was a physical presence in their home, a manifestation of a century of stolen life and broken promises. They were trapped in a sanctuary that had become a cage. The sins of the past often cast the longest shadows. True honesty requires us to acknowledge the wrongs of those who came before us, for ignoring history does not erase its consequences. As the pacing finally stopped and a heavy silence returned to the house, Elias felt something cold and wet against his ankle. He shone his light down and saw the black bile from the cellar seeping under the pantry door. And in the fluid, spelled out in perfect, elegant script, were the words, "Who will pay?" The morning following the night in the pantry brought no relief, only a cold, gray light that seemed to drain the color from the Maryland landscape. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a world that felt sodden and bruised. Elias and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the ledger of the Blackwood debt lying between them like a live grenade. They were exhausted, their eyes rimmed with red, but their focus was entirely on Lily. The young girl was sitting on the floor in the hallway, staring intently into the tall, mahogany-framed mirror that leaned against the wall, a relic of the house that they hadn't yet moved. At first, it seemed like typical childhood curiosity, but as the minutes ticked by, the way Lily sat, perfectly still, her spine unnaturally straight, began to churn Sarah's stomach. "Lily, honey, why don't you come have some oatmeal?" Sarah called out, her voice cracking. Lily didn't turn. She didn't blink. She simply continued to stare at her own reflection, her lips moving in a silent, rapid rhythm as if she were reciting a feverish poem. Elias stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron fire poker he'd kept near him since dawn. He walked toward his daughter, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. As he approached, he glanced at the mirror, expecting to see the back of Lily's head and his own tired face. Instead, his heart skipped a beat and then plummeted. In the reflection, Lily wasn't sitting. The reflected Lily was standing up, leaning forward against the glass from the inside, her palms pressed against the surface. The most terrifying detail, however, was her eyes. In the physical world, Lily had bright, hazel eyes full of life. In the mirror, the girl's eyes were two bottomless pits of spilled ink, pure, glossy black from lid to lid. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was a jagged, predatory grin that stretched too wide, revealing rows of teeth that looked like shards of broken porcelain. The mirror Lily began to tap on the glass from the inside, tap, 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 a sound that echoed not from the mirror, but from inside Elias's own skull. "Get away from there!" Elias barked, grabbing Lily by the shoulders and pulling her back. Lily let out a sharp, piercing cry, finally breaking her trance. She collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing hysterically. "She won't let me go, Daddy. She says I'm the empty one. She says she needs my skin because hers is too cold." Sarah rushed over, wrapping them both in a frantic embrace, her eyes darting to the mirror. The reflection was back to normal now, just a terrified family huddled on the floor, but the glass remained unnaturally frosted, and the scent of the cellar had filled the hallway. The conflict escalated as Sarah realized the entity wasn't just haunting the house. It was hunting their daughter's identity. The hollowed man from the ledger wasn't looking for a guest. He was looking for a vessel. The betrayal of Silas Blackwood had created a vacuum, and according to the curse, that vacuum needed to be filled with the new blood of the lineage. Every time Lily looked into a reflective surface, a window, a glass of water, a mirror, the thing in the dark took another piece of her spirit. In a desperate attempt to protect her child, Sarah began covering every mirror in the house with heavy quilts and bedsheets. She moved with a frantic, religious energy, duct taping the edges to ensure no sliver of glass remained exposed. But as she finished the last mirror in the upstairs hallway, she heard a soft, rhythmic scratching from behind the cloth. It sounded like fingernails on glass. A small, muffled voice, Lily's voice, whispered from behind the sheet. "You can cover the glass, Mommy, but you can't cover the water in your own eyes." Elias realized that the house was no longer just a physical structure. It had become a psychological trap. The resolution of the afternoon was a grim one. They decided to barricade themselves in the master bedroom, the only room Sarah had managed to bless with what remained of her spiritual strength. They moved a heavy dresser in front of the door, and Elias stayed by the window watching the woods. The trees seemed to be leaning closer to the house, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the siding. Innocence is a great light, but it must be guarded by the wisdom of the elders. We must protect the most vulnerable among us not just from physical harm, but from the influences that seek to dim their inner light. Late that night, as a heavy silence fell over the room, Sarah looked at Lily, who was finally sleeping. Her heart stopped when she noticed that Lily's shadow, cast against the wall by the flickering candle, wasn't moving in sync with the girl. While Lily lay perfectly still, her shadow was slowly, silently, raising a hand to its throat. The moon over rural Maryland was usually a comforting, silver orb that guided the deer through the thickets. But on this night, it was strangled. A thick, unnatural vapor began to rise from the Blackwood Creek, crawling over the banks and swallowing the cornfields. It wasn't the white, ethereal fog of a typical morning. This was a deep, unsettling crimson, the color of oxidized iron and dried rose petals. It moved with a purposeful intelligence, hugging the ground and spiraling up the sides of the manor until the windows were blinded by a pulsing, red gloom. Inside the master bedroom, the air grew heavy, making every breath feel like inhaling damp wool. Elias stood by the window, his fingers white-knuckled as he pulled back a corner of the curtain. He couldn't see the SUV parked just 20 feet away. He couldn't even see the porch railing. The world beyond the glass had been replaced by a shimmering, bloody void. "It's not letting us leave, Sarah," he whispered, his voice sounding hollow. "The mist, it's like a wall. It's not air. It's a barrier." The psychological weight of their isolation began to take its toll. The house, which had previously felt like a creaky old building, now felt like a living organism that was slowly digesting them. The red mist began to seep through the most impossible places. The keyholes, the gaps under the door, even the electrical outlets. It didn't dissipate. It coiled on the floor like sleeping snakes, glowing with a faint, rhythmic light that matched the heartbeat Elias had heard on their first night. The conflict reached a fever pitch when the shadow Lily had cast earlier finally detached itself from the wall. As the red mist filled the room, the shadow didn't need a light source to exist anymore. It slid across the floorboards, a silhouette of a young girl, but moving with a jerky, disjointed gait that no human could mimic. It circled Sarah, who was huddled on the bed with the real Lily. Every time the shadow passed, Sarah felt a wave of absolute despair, a cold so profound it felt like her heart was being dipped in liquid nitrogen. "Leave her alone," Elias shouted, swinging the iron poker at the darkened shape on the floor. But the poker passed through the shadow as if it were nothing but smoke. The shadow stopped at the foot of the bed and slowly grew in height, stretching and distorting until it took the shape of the tall, eyeless man from the ledger. The mist in the room began to swirl violently, forming a vortex around the entity. The hollowed man reached out a long, translucent hand toward Lily, and for the first time he spoke. It wasn't a voice of sound, but a vibration that rattled their teeth. "The debt is overdue. The land remembers the betrayal." In that moment of pure terror, Sarah did something she hadn't done since the rosary broke. She didn't reach for a symbol or a bead. She reached for Elias's hand and Lily's hand, pulling them into a tight circle. She didn't pray for the entity to leave. She prayed for the strength to stand together. "We are not the ancestors," she cried out into the red gloom. "The sins of Silas Blackwood are not our own. We are a family of our own making." As they gripped each other's hands, a soft, golden light, faint but steady, began to emanate from where their palms met. It was the light of a bond that no curse could easily sever. The red mist recoiled from them, hissing like water on a hot griddle. The shadow entity let out a low, frustrated moan and dissolved back into the mist, which began to retreat toward the door. The physical manifestation had failed to break them, but the siege was far from over. The resolution was a fragile peace. The mist remained outside, pressing against the house, and the shadows returned to their proper places, but the family was changed. They realized that their only weapon against the pure evil of the manor wasn't something they could find in a book or a box. It was the purity of their love for one another. However, as the first light of dawn struggled to pierce the red haze, Elias noticed something on his own arm. Beneath his sleeve, 3 long, red welts had appeared, as if he had been branded. True bravery is found in unity. When we stand together, our combined light can push back the deepest shadows, but we must be prepared for the marks that the struggle leaves behind. As the red mist finally began to thin, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the woods, standing just outside the property line. It was an old man in a black suit, holding a worn Bible and a wooden staff. He looked at the house, shook his head sadly, and began to walk toward the front door. "I'm late." They heard his voice echo through the house, though he was still 100 yards away. "I'm so very late." The stranger who stood at the threshold of Blackwood Manor looked as though he had been carved from the very oaks that surrounded the property. His face was a map of deep-set wrinkles, and his eyes, though clouded by age, held a clarity that seemed to pierce through the lingering red mist. He introduced himself simply as Pastor Abraham, a man whose family had tended to the spiritual needs of this Maryland Valley since the days of the circuit riders. He didn't ask to come in. He waited to be invited, his wooden staff planted firmly in the mud. "I saw the sky turn the color of a slaughterhouse floor last night," Abraham said, his voice like the low rumble of a distant storm. "When the earth groans and the sky bleeds in these parts, it means the hollowed man is restless. You millers have walked into a trap set 2 centuries ago." Elias, feeling the sting of the 3 welts on his arm, stepped aside to let the old man enter. As Abraham crossed the threshold, the house seemed to exhale, a long, rattling draft that blew out the few candles they had lit. In the kitchen, Abraham laid out his tools. There were no flashy relics or vials of holy water from across the sea. Instead, he produced a small jar of local honey, a bag of coarse salt harvested from the Chesapeake, and a worn, leather-bound Bible that smelled of tobacco and old paper. This land was taken through deceit, Abraham explained, his eyes fixed on the cellar door. The entity you face isn't just a ghost. It is a manifestation of a broken covenant. It feeds on the emptiness, the secrets, the fears, and the lack of faith. To fight it, we must fill this house with a different kind of presence. The vigil began as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the Maryland woods into a predatory darkness. Abraham instructed the family to sit in a circle in the parlor, the salt spread in a perfect, unbroken ring around them. He began to chant, not in Latin, but in a rhythmic Old English cadence of psalms and folk prayers. For the first hour, the house remained unervingly silent. Then the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low hum and escalated until the furniture began to dance and chatter against the walls. The conflict intensified when the entity realized it could no longer reach them through the salt. The temperature in the room dropped so low that the family's eyelashes began to frost. Then the voices started. It wasn't just the hollowed man. It was the voices of Elias's own ancestors, a cacophony of Silas Blackwood's descendants, all wailing in a chorus of eternal hunger. The walls of the parlor began to bleed, not blood, but the thick, black bile from the cellar, spelling out the family's secret shames on the wallpaper. "Don't listen to the lies of the soil," Abraham shouted over the roar of the haunting. He stood up, his staff glowing with a faint, internal light. He moved toward the cellar door, which was now buckled and bowing outward as if something immense was pressing against it from the other side. The entity lashed out, throwing heavy books and shards of glass at the preacher. A splinter of wood sliced Abraham's cheek, but he didn't falter. He pressed his palm against the door and began to sing a hymn, a song of deliverance that had been passed down through the Maryland hills for generations. The resolution of the night was a violent one. With a sound like a lightning strike, the cellar door cracked down the middle. A wave of cold, oppressive energy surged out, knocking Elias and Sarah back against the wall. But Abraham stood his ground, his voice rising in a crescendo of spiritual authority. He forced the darkness back down the stairs, sealing the crack with a mixture of salt and oil. The house suddenly went still, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for the family to catch their breath. Abraham turned to Elias, his face pale and his breathing labored. He pointed to the welts on Elias's arm. "The vigil has bought you time, but the mark you bear is a claim. The hollowed man has tasted your blood, Elias. He doesn't just want the house anymore. He wants the lineage." The preacher's eyes were grave. He explained that while the vigil had pushed the evil back, it hadn't broken the curse. To do that, Elias would have to face the source of the debt himself, in the place where the betrayal first happened. Wisdom is a gift from those who have endured the darkness before us. To overcome a great evil, one must have the humility to seek guidance and the strength to listen to uncomfortable truths. As Abraham prepared to leave at dawn, promising to return with more provisions, he pulled Elias aside. "Keep your eyes on the child," he whispered. The entity left the cellar door because it found another way in. "Look at her shadow, Elias. Look at it when she thinks no one is watching." Elias turned to look at Lily, who was playing with her dolls. In the morning light, her shadow was no longer a little girl. It was a tall, eyeless man, holding a spectral scythe. The 3 welts on Elias's arm didn't just sting. They began to pulse with a dull, rhythmic heat that synchronized perfectly with the phantom heartbeat of the house. As the sun climbed higher into the Maryland sky, the heat became a searing agony, as if a hot iron were being pressed into his muscle. Elias knew he couldn't wait for Pastor Abraham to return with more provisions. The preacher's warning about Lily's shadow had ignited a fire of desperation in his chest. He looked at his daughter, who was sitting on the porch, her back to him. Her shadow, cast long by the morning sun, was still stretched into the shape of that tall, eyeless specter, its elongated fingers dancing near her heels. Armed with the ledger of the Blackwood debt and a rusted compass, Elias slipped out the back door, leaving Sarah to watch over Lily within the salt-ringed safety of the parlor. He followed the faded, hand-drawn map in the back of the ledger, heading deep into the untamed woods that bordered the property. The Maryland forest felt different today. The birds were silent, and the very trees seemed to lean away from the path he walked, their branches clicking together like dry bone. He was heading for the Blackwood Hollow, the site where the original betrayal had taken place over 200 years ago. As he reached the center of the woods, the air grew unnaturally still. The humidity of the Maryland summer vanished, replaced by a dry, suffocating heat that smelled of wood smoke and old, dried parchment. In a clearing choked with thorn bushes and gray, leafless vines, Elias found it. The ruins of a small stone hearth, all that remained of the healer's cabin. Standing in the center of the clearing was a massive, ancient oak tree, its trunk twisted into a shape that looked like a man screaming in agony. This was the spot where Silas Blackwood had made his dark bargain, and where the hollowed man had been born of spite and sorrow. Suddenly, the ground beneath Elias's feet felt soft, like rotting fruit. The forest around him began to shimmer and dissolve, and for a terrifying moment, the present bled into the past. He wasn't seeing the woods of 2026. He was seeing the forest of 1792. Through a veil of spiritual miasma, he saw his ancestor, Silas, a man with his own eyes, his own jawline, and the same desperate look of a father trying to save his legacy. But Silas wasn't alone. He was kneeling before a figure shrouded in a tattered deerskin cloak. Elias watched in horror as Silas took a knife and sliced his own palm, letting the blood drip onto the roots of the oak tree. "I give the soil what it asks." Silas's voice echoed through the centuries, sounding like grinding stones. "Take the hunger from my belly and put it into the earth. I trade the peace of my blood for the wealth of my house." The figure in the cloak stood, and as the hood fell back, Elias saw not a man, but a void, a creature made of shadow and emptiness that had been waiting for an invitation. Silas hadn't just made a deal for crops. He had traded the spiritual fullness of every generation that followed him to satisfy his own temporary greed. The hollowed man wasn't a ghost. He was the personification of that bottomless, ancestral hunger. The vision snapped shut like a book, leaving Elias gasping for air in the silent clearing. The welts on his arm burst open, trickling a thin stream of dark, obsidian-colored blood. The ground began to tremble, and from the hollow of the ancient oak, the entity began to emerge. It didn't crawl. It unfolded, its skeletal frame reaching a height of nearly 8 feet. The hollowed man didn't have a face, yet Elias felt a gaze of pure, icy hatred fixed upon him. "The debt is not in gold," the entity hissed, the sound vibrating in Elias's marrow. "The debt is the life that Silas promised. One must be empty so the rest may be full." Elias realized the terrible truth. The entity wasn't just haunting them because they were there. It was there to claim the empty vessel Silas had promised. That vessel was Lily. The entity had been slowly draining her spirit through the mirrors and the shadows to prepare her for occupancy. In a moment of frantic bravery, Elias stood his ground, raising the ledger. "I am the head of this house," he roared. "If there is a debt of blood, take it from the one who carries the mark. Leave the child out of your hunger." The hollowed man paused, its eyeless head tilting. It lunged forward, its hand passing through Elias's chest. It didn't hurt like a wound. It felt like a vacuum, pulling every happy memory, every ounce of warmth, and every shred of hope out of his body. Elias collapsed to his knees, his vision fading to gray. But as he fell, he felt a surge of Sarah's faith and Lily's innocence through the connection of the mark. He wasn't empty. He was filled with the love of his family. The entity recoiled, let out a shriek that split the ancient oak down the middle, and vanished into a cloud of black dust. To truly atone for the past, one must be willing to take responsibility for the legacy they inherit. Honesty about our history is the only way to prevent the mistakes of our ancestors from consuming our future. Elias stumbled back to the manor, his body weak and his spirit bruised, but the burning in his arm had stopped. He burst through the front door, calling for Sarah and Lily. He found them in the parlor, but the salt ring had been broken. Sarah was slumped on the floor, unconscious, and Lily was gone. The only thing left in the room was a small, hand-drawn map on the floor, sketched in black bile, pointing toward the one place Elias hadn't searched. The room behind the wax-sealed door in the cellar. The air inside Blackwood Manor had turned into a thick, oily soup that tasted of copper and old wet earth. Elias knelt beside Sarah, his hands shaking as he pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was thready, a faint drumbeat echoing from a great distance. She wasn't wounded, but she was deeply, unnaturally asleep, as if her consciousness had been forcibly pushed out of her body. He looked at the shattered salt ring and the map drawn in black bile on the floorboards. The message was clear. The entity had stopped playing games. It had taken the heart of the home to force the final confrontation. Elias stumbled toward the kitchen, his body feeling like lead after his ordeal in the woods. He grabbed a heavy iron lantern and headed for the cellar door. The boards he had nailed across it were not broken. They were dissolved. The wood turned into a soft, pulpy rot that smelled of a stagnant swamp. As he descended the stairs, the darkness didn't just obscure his vision. It felt heavy, pushing against his chest like the weight of a deep ocean. The lantern's flame flickered blue, struggling to survive in an atmosphere that seemed to reject the very concept of light. At the bottom of the stairs, the small, wax-sealed door stood wide open. The blackened wax lay on the floor like discarded skin. Beyond the door was a room that shouldn't have existed. A stone-walled chamber that felt as though it were carved directly into the bedrock of Maryland itself. In the center of the room, Lily stood atop a raised stone dais. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. Her eyes were wide, but they were no longer hazel. They were shifting like liquid mercury, reflecting scenes of a colonial past that she had never lived. "Lily, look at me," Elias cried, his voice echoing in the cramped space. But as he stepped forward, the shadows in the room detached themselves from the walls. They weren't just shapes. They were manifestations of Elias's deepest failures and fears. He saw himself losing his job. He saw himself failing to protect Sarah. He saw the moments of anger and doubt he had hidden even from himself. The hollowed man stood behind Lily, its long, spindly fingers resting on her shoulders. It didn't need to attack Elias physically. It was feeding him his own emptiness, trying to hollow him out so he would give up. The conflict of the soul was more agonizing than any physical blow. The entity whispered into his mind, its voice 1,000 dry leaves. "Why fight for a lineage of thieves? Your blood is tainted. Your faith is a paper shield. Give her to the earth, and you shall have the peace of the void." Elias felt his knees buckle. The weight of the Blackwood debt felt too heavy for one man to carry. He looked at Lily, and for a moment, he saw the eyeless pits beginning to form in her own sockets. The entity was starting the transition. Lily was being emptied to make room for the ancient hunger. But as Elias felt the last of his strength fading, he remembered the mark on his arm. It wasn't just a brand of ownership. It was a connection. He realized that the hollowed man could only take what was given. Silas had given his blood, but Elias could give something Silas never had: a selfless sacrifice. He didn't focus on his fear. He focused on the memory of Lily's first laugh, of Sarah's hand in his at their wedding, of the simple Maryland sun on a summer day. He filled the hollowness with the weight of his love. The resolution of the trial came when Elias reached out and gripped the stone dais, ignoring the frost that burned his palms. "I am Elias Miller," he whispered, his voice gaining strength. "I am the son of the suns, but I am not the slave of your hunger. You want a vessel? You want a Blackwood to pay the debt." He looked the eyeless entity directly in its shadowed face. "Then take the father. Leave the child. I offer my life for hers, not out of greed, but out of grace." The room went violently silent. The mercury light in Lily's eyes flickered and died, replaced by the terrified hazel of a 10-year-old girl. The hollowed man let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a sigh of 1,000 years of disappointment. The deal Silas had made was based on selfishness. A selfless offer was a poison to the entity's nature. The stone walls began to crack, and the black bile started to recede, flowing back into the earth like a defeated tide. Pure evil preys on our secrets and our sense of inadequacy. To defeat it, we must be honest about our flaws and realize that our capacity for love is the only thing that can never truly be hollowed out. Lily collapsed into Elias's arms, her breath returning in ragged gasps. But as they turned to leave the chamber, the heavy stone door began to swing shut on its own. From the darkness behind them, the hollowed man's voice gave one final, chilling warning. A life for a life was the price. The Father has spoken. The earth will have its due before the sun rises. The stone door of the hidden chamber groaned as it began to slide shut, threatening to entomb Elias and Lily in the cold heart of the Maryland soil. With a desperate surge of strength, Elias shoved Lily through the narrowing gap, feeling the rough stone scrape against his back. He tumbled out behind her just as the door slammed shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of Blackwood Manor. The cellar was no longer a place of whispers. It was a place of violent transition. The house was screaming, the timber joists twisting and snapping like dry kindling. They scrambled up the stairs to the kitchen, where they found Sarah gasping for air, her consciousness returning as the entity's grip on the house faltered. But the dawn of deliverance was not yet won. The life for a life pact Elias had invoked in the darkness was manifesting. The black welts on Elias's arm began to spread, turning his veins into dark, branching rivers. He felt his heart slowing, his very essence being pulled toward the floorboards. The earth was attempting to claim its payment before the first light of day could break the curse. "Elias!" Sarah cried, rushing to him as he collapsed against the kitchen table. She saw the darkness spreading across his skin. She didn't reach for her broken rosary this time. Instead, she grabbed the ledger of the Blackwood debt. She realized that as long as the record of the sin existed, the debt would remain active. "It's the paper, Elias. It's the memory of the greed that keeps him here." She ran to the hearth, where a single ember still glowed from the previous night's fire. The conflict reached its peak as the hollowed man made one final, desperate manifestation. He appeared in the center of the kitchen, not as a shadow, but as a towering figure of ancient, desiccated wood and bone. He reached for the ledger, his eyeless face contorted in a silent roar. But Lily, standing tall despite her terror, stepped in front of her mother. She held out the silver locket Elias had found, the one containing the ancestor's tooth. "You don't want us," she whispered, her voice steady. "You just want to be remembered, but we choose to forget." Sarah tossed the ledger into the coals. For a heartbeat, the room went blindingly white. As the ancient parchment caught fire, the screams of 200 years of trapped spirits echoed through the halls. The black bile on the walls turned to steam, and the heavy metallic scent of the house was replaced by the sharp, clean smell of ozone and wood smoke. The hollowed man began to dissolve, his form turning into harmless gray ash that was caught by a sudden, morning breeze blowing through the open windows. As the last page of the ledger turned to cinder, the darkness on Elias's arm vanished. The cold weight in his chest evaporated, replaced by a warmth that felt like a Maryland sunrise. Outside, the first rays of light finally broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, piercing through the trees and illuminating the manor in a way they hadn't seen since they arrived. The red mist was gone. The hollowed ground was just dirt again. The debt was not paid with a death, but cancelled by a sacrifice of love and the destruction of a hateful legacy. The resolution was one of quiet, somber peace. The Millers didn't leave the house immediately. They spent the morning sitting on the porch watching the world wake up. They knew the house would never be normal, and the scars of the haunting would remain in their memories forever. But the air was light, the birds were singing, and for the first time, Blackwood Manor felt like a home rather than a tomb. They had faced pure evil and had come out on the other side, not by being stronger, but by being more whole. We are not defined by the shadows of our ancestors, but by the light we choose to create in the present. Bravery is found in the willingness to sacrifice ourselves for those we love, and honesty is the fire that consumes the debts of the past. As the family packed their SUV to head into town for a much-needed breakfast, Elias looked back at the house one last time. In the window of the cellar, he saw a small white flower, a Maryland lily, growing through a crack in the stone. The hunger was gone. The land was finally at rest.